Um, Today, I'm going to talk about something that's kind of interesting because we're talking about it right now in my philosophy group thread, I guess you'd say, where um, we're discussing. Nobody's accusing anybody, but we're discussing the concept of sexual harassment, particularly in the workplace and the schools and stuff, of men directed against women, almost always, um, and it's a wild subject to me because the experiences of women. This is definitely one of those things where when you're 6'1" and 200 pounds and stuff, I am not the target. I am not interesting to the kind of people who are going to get aggressive and handsy and stuff, right? So it's very easy for me to misunderstand, or rather not misunderstand, but just not appreciate the world that women often live in. Because I mean, I'm sure I've been looked, considered kind of a creep or whatever from time to time because I'm staring a little too long because I think a girl is pretty or whatever. And I think there's a difference between just, wow, that's a pretty girl, and then some of the stuff that these girls have gone through where people are just like pawn them on their more sensitive parts as in the workplace, and everybody else is just like that's the way it is here, like it would never actually occur to me. It never has ever occurred to me to just walk up and start grabbing someone like that who I was not already like intimate with in that way, right? And I don't know why that is. I can't understand any kind of physical contact really at all, especially of an intimate nature that wasn't wanted. I don't want somebody to not want me or involved with them. It's nothing is a greater turnoff than me, which is to me, which is why I don't understand the crimes that men sometimes commit. Because like if a girl is saying no, I don't want this, like I, my body just simply does the reacts in a very negative way to that, like, oh god, okay, I'm out of here, I'm gonna go curl up in the corner or whatever, it just I in general I just don't ever consider taking what's not offered. But with that, it's visceral. It's just part of who I am, and this is not me tooting my own horn or touting my virtues or anything. It's just it's literally almost inconceivable, some of the stuff that women experience on a daily basis in some cases, or what is often by their own societies is just like, well, sometimes that's the way it goes. Boys will be boys. Oh, I hate that phrase. What do you mean by that? I mean, if you're talking about like getting in the mud and tracking mud through the house, yeah, okay. that's I'm guilty of that sin. But when you're talking about bullying girls and making them feel uncomfortable and stuff, which did happen from time to time in school, that was not a boys will be boys thing. That was a bullies being bullies thing, at least as I'm concerned, but and it brings to mind when I would talk with my ex, and she would talk about her early days working in the office, and she would be talking about how these old men would be just groping her all day long, like every day, and that was office culture. Women had to put up with that in the old days, and it's only been fairly recently that we at least have laws and HR, kind of things. Because and the only reason that's happening is because things got so egregious that people started taking others to court over it, and then companies would get sued for providing a safe environment for these guys to act the way they were, that basically permitted people to be molested and raped and stuff. And this is not hasn't gone away either. The Blizzard, the video game company, when they finally had all these lawsuits and stuff, which was an interesting thing because that was tied in with a whole kind of ball of wax called Gamergate, which it's hard to know what's going on with that one as it is, right? But the kind of the crux of that issue is that there was a girl who was making a video game, and she would get positive reviews from guys that she in some way, again I don't know exactly, was intimate with, or they claimed to be intimate with her or whatever. And there became this perception that she was basically sleeping with people to get positive reviews for her shitty game, you know, and her game was shitty. Okay, I'm just going to admit that. But she became lionized as this feminist icon, and the more extreme side of the toxic masculine area of the internet was like this chick blah blah blah, right? And it just became this whole war of the sexes that just blew up, right? So there's already inherent distrust from a number of men in particular that these accusations were, disingenuous in some way or another. And then when you come to find out in the Blizzard documents after all that lawsuit played out, oh my God, there was definitely a you want to work here or you got to party with us kind of mentality. They had a thing they even called the Cosby Room, referring to the fact that Bill Cosby would roofie some of his female associates and then have his way with them. It's just wild that this stuff is going on and of course they lost half their staff. Then Blizzard imploded and they got bought by Microsoft because it gutted that company, and rightly so. But it's the thing is it in the same way that the Epstein files, which I've had to come to terms with because I'm a conspiracy theorist over the past 10 years or whatever, slowly, and like, this can't be true, this can't be true. Oh my God, that is so awful. Boy, this is there's a lot of connections here, but it can't be true, it can't be true. Like, you slowly start chipping away at this stuff, and it's demoralizing. It really is. You're like, people are truly horrifyingly bad, and I don't know how far that goes, man, because I'm still struggling with believing some of the more extreme stuff they're talking about there. But in that same way, because you can't perceive it, because it's not something you would do, and you can even hear people tell stories, but you're like, man, that's crazy. That can't be real, right? Because you just, you know, the brain is an interesting thing. Falling into a different thing, and there's a video that went around, that was it was called a symphony, an ode to the brain, the symphony of science. One of the things that they sing about, but it's from a speech this guy made, was talking about basically like the brain engages in quantum theory a lot. It's basically creates every single moment, like just me doing something like this, like moving my hands. You have to envision a possibility where your hands get moved and then follow through on that reality that you're creating in your head. And the brain does this just constantly dealing with your reality, thinking about possibilities, very simple possibilities, and then collapsing all those various potential universes on a just on so fast basis. It's how it perceives reality and then helps us move through reality, right? But when we sit back and ponder things like, what'll happen if I decide to quit this job or whatever, you're going through this various exercise of creating this more elaborate universe, right? This more elaborate set of possibilities, and exploring and tracking through all this cause and effect stuff it's the brain is cool, and reality is cool, and perception is cool, and all that other stuff. And laughter is actually when you make a connection. It's There's one theory anyway, is when you make a connection that's not supposed to happen when you're doing this exercise. So that's why when a comedian will tell you something and it's a turn of phrase, or he brings it back to something he was saying, or it's just very silly, you start to laugh because there's a logical connection that you make, but it cannot happen. And that collapse actually amuses us when it's forced on us, right? um, but when it comes to stuff like that, when somebody, you go into a courtroom or whatever, you have to sit on a jury or whatever, and they're telling you these horrible things. I've never been on a jury. I actually kind of wish I would get the opportunity. Please, judge, but I guess not. It'll probably be a traffic ticket thing I have to deal with, not something fun. But anyway, you're presented with a story, and because you don't have those pathways, or they're so hard for you to even perceive as being something that can happen from your own perspective, because a lot of things we empathize as human beings. We tend to insert ourselves into the shoes of another and then go down that path, right? I've never been a woman, but if I put my feet in their shoes in my mind and think about what they're talking about, I can walk along the path that they're talking about, even though I do not share the same physical experience as a human being. I can still relate in most of the ways, usually, that they're talking about, and other things that are different. different, I can imagine as a branch of a possibility that, oh, hey, if I weighed half the weight I do and was attractive, that doesn't work. But if you're a pretty girl or whatever, and walking down the street and you weigh lighter than most of the people, most humans that are around you, and you're wearing high heels and stuff, which are, you're not running in those things unless you're real skilled, and you can fall and hurt and everything else. And there are these larger creatures around you and they're acting hostile. I can imagine that, and the fear that it would embrace, right? Just the raw fear. So, but I myself actually had a hard time as an adult perceiving my own size and strength. And it was pointed out to me when I was practicing karate, because finally it's, you have these instructors and you get in sparring and stuff like that. Sparring is, combat. And I was always making myself small and very defensive. I'm a very defensive fighter. I almost never strike first unless I'm, toying around and being, intentionally aggressive. But my natural instinct is to wait for the enemy to move, because I'd rather them just stop. It's just that's how I fight. But the thing is, that doesn't really work very well in sparring, right? But it's just that's my natural tendency. But the thing is um, I had not been in any physical engagement of combat really since middle school, and that's just schoolyard scuffles and stuff like that. And I was much smaller then. And finally, one of the instructors, this was like maybe a year or something, pretty far into my karate career, really, when you get down to it. He's sizing me up and he finally goes, "You think you're smaller than you are. You think you don't realize how intimidating you are. You got to use that to your advantage," right? Like that's the thing. You get out there, own that space, and all that other stuff, right? But I realized that was true, because of the and he said, try it, so you get into, a little while later, I got into the ring with this kid that's, a black belt, higher rank than I was. And we were going to spar off, but he's a kid and he's smaller, and I rah, just jump into the ring, and he actually lost because he jumped out of the ring, and everybody laughed, because it's just for fun. But that was when I kind of first woke up to how big I am, and that's part of the reason why I ended up being an uke a lot in that studio, because I was basically one of the largest guys. There are two others I can think of that were larger, and neither of them. One was a kid, and he was on drill team and stuff. He wasn't around very often, at least in the role. And I took on a senpai role, an assistant teacher, and then the other guy was just a parent of a kid that just left the school once his kid got a black belt. Um, but I really took it seriously, because the instructors wanted to see if their stuff actually worked, and I'm a great target. And then for when you're dealing with teenagers and sometimes the ladies' classes, well, that was an interesting scenario. But the simple fact is, I fit the profile of the guy who jumps out of the van, or is hiding in the bushes or whatever. I'm bigger. I think that I have the drop on you, and I don't want this to be a fair fight. I'm taking what I want, right? That's the kind of guy you're dealing with. And he's probably going to be built something like me, and learning these techniques to practice against someone that's much larger than you has great value to them. And I'll tell you what, man. Oh my gosh. So you would get into these classes, and this is the first time this ever happened. This kid, her name was Damiola, and she kind of had a kind of a rivalry. They were like 13 or 14 or something, and she had a rivalry with this other girl. I forget what her name was, Jennifer or Melissa, something like that. Anyway, but they were always throwing daggers at each other, these two. And I kind of played on that, right? Because I come in and I say, okay, they said I could teach the class that time, and it was Jubilee. It was basically after tests and stuff like that, and so you could kind of teach whatever you want. And I said, today you're going to throw me. All of you are going to throw me. These teenage kids that are like 100 pounds, 120 pounds or whatever. They're nothing, And so they're like, uh-huh. And so I'm like, I started with Daniola, and I looked at her. She's just got this dull look in her face. And it said everything I needed to know, which was that she's like, this guy might let me throw him, but I'm not going to be doing this myself. And I looked at her and I said, I don't think you're taking this seriously. I think I'm gonna have you go back in line and have Melissa do it instead, or whatever her name was. And Teddy Hall's like, no. So I got to, well, like, all right, then let's take this seriously. And I teach her the technique, right? And long story short, the technique is effectively like it's the way we teach it is with a lazy haymaker that comes to the face, which you don't often see except maybe in the bar with a drunk guy. But what women see is this, right? So it's a similar defense, and it essentially stops that motion and gets you in a position where you're using your leg, the largest muscles of your body, to torque their hip and make them roll off your hip and fall on their side, right? And so then you've got their arm essentially, and they're on their side, and you can do anything you want. You can go after the throat, you can go after the kidney, you can just lean back and basically make their arm not usable for many weeks, or whatever. Or you can just run. It's going to take them a while. It's a great technique. I really love that one. But it also allows for the size disparity. That was the thing. And so this girl was so worked up, and I'm like, show her the technique, and I'm like, all right, go ahead. And, Hajime. And boy, she executed it with black belt precision. Boy, I just, whoop, I was in the air and boom, onto the ground. She took my feet right out from under me, and I kind of lost my breath. And so I looked up at her, from the side, and she's like, ah! She was just so worked into it. But once she realized she had done it, the power that came into her eyes, she realized, like, I did that. That was the real deal. I took this man down. She could feel it. She knew. That was nothing I could do. I mean, obviously, I knew it was coming, but when she did the technique, I could not have done anything at that point. And she had me over her hip. She had me up in the air. She had me down on the ground. And once you're in the air, you're only going where gravity takes you. She had me, if she wanted to, dead to rights. That's what I'm teaching. And they always say the same thing when they do that. Oh, I got so addicted to that thing, that look in their eyes, because that first time they realize this stuff actually works. They look at you and they go, let's do it again. And I was like, yeah, I got you. But the thing is that class, that whole experience made me realize that, and I was challenged on this. The word is not fear. I don't want to use fear, but um, women, most women are living in a world of kind of this low simmering caution, maybe trepidation. I don't know what you would use. It's not like they're afraid of the world or whatever, but they have to live in this world where they're surrounded by large primates that are mostly bigger than them. And at any time, and you see this happen, a guy in a restaurant, you know, he ordered a Coke and she gave him a Diet Coke, and he just flips out and starts tossing everything on, when that happens and I'm in the proximity, my first thought is, okay, this dude's flipping out. Am I going to have to get involved, right? And make sure that I protect the people that are my wards, but also, am I going to have to stop him? Because if he comes in my direction, all right, let's go. I don't want any trouble, but if you're going to get flip out, I'm going to stop you, right? But for most women, most people, in fact, I would argue in that situation, they want to get out of there as fast as possible because they actually can't really do much. If this guy turns his attention on you, you're in trouble, right? Like, it's not to say that I wouldn't be in trouble, but I because of who I am and my training and all that other stuff, I feel like I can handle it. Now, there are some guys where I look at him and I'm like, oh, I don't know what I would do if I had to deal with this guy. There are a couple of those guys out there, like maybe the knees, but, um, but anyway, the thing is they live in this different world, and especially when it becomes the fact that the reality is, like I said, if somebody's actually sitting in a van watching me and they're like, ooh, I'm like, wow, really? That's going to be flattering. You know what I mean? I don't get catcalled. I don't have anybody grab my ass. I don't have any of that stuff that a lot of women talk about, that is just common. And then people are very dismissive. That's the other thing. Someone would come up. obviously karate is physical and stuff like that. We had a lot of rules about that stuff and we were very serious about it. And I don't remember any significant situation where somebody did anything that wasn't on accident. The big one is you don't touch the chest, right, of a girl. But when you're in sparring, sometimes you hit and oh God, I'm sorry, and it's just, then you got to do 20 push-ups or whatever, because it's off limits. But that's the kind of case where just shit happens. It's part of the deal, and it's not to minimize it, whatever, but it's you know what I mean. It's not intentional, right? And we are in a physical environment about combat, um, but if anybody had ever come up to me and been like, I don't like the way so and so was touching me. I don't like, he was doing. Oh my God, I'd be flipping out. Not in my classroom, not on my floor. You know what I mean? Like you're gonna get it, and it's not a matter of whether or not I believe her. It's a matter of her feeling that way and making sure that whoever was doing that understands whatever it was that they were doing was not something that was welcome, right? Because regardless of intent, okay, you made a mistake, apologize, you know, and whatever it was, don't do it again because you're going to be in serious trouble with me if that happens again, right? But authority figures don't do this. They don't take it seriously, and that shocks me. Oh, he was just joking. Boys will be boys, you know, or whatever. No, no, and I just can't imagine acting this way and just dismissing that stuff this way, right? It's manners. It's basic manners. But then, again, I hear stories from women, about, I remember one girlfriend, she's like, what did you tell your friends, after I'd, been intimate with her for a while. I'm like, what are you talking about? I mean, what do they know about what we do? I'm like, I didn't tell them anything. What are you talking about? Because I don't kiss and tell. Her experience was that's what guys do. They do these things with the girls and then they go and share it with their friends. And now all the guys are looking at her about what she does. Never occurred to me. Never occurred to me. Ever. I think the only time anybody ever knew anything about it is when I came home with a bunch of hickeys. My roommate looked at me and was like, because he knew I was going to have a hard time with that one going to work. But that's it. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if this is a rare thing because I hear it so frequently, you know, and I don't know if I just missed the memo or what. But it's so shocking to hear these stories over and over and over. And I struggle to imagine what they're going through. And all I can say is, no, boys will not be boys. Jerks will be jerks. You know, predators will be predators. And one of the ones that was going around when I was in karate and was actually kind of an interesting scenario was teach men not to rape. Teach men not to rape. Okay. Well, here's a little fact about that one. All men know, unless they're raised in the wild by wolves, they know better. That you don't take anything that's not offered, especially something like that. All men know not to rape. Some people don't care. They don't care about civilization. They don't care about the rules. They just want whatever they want for themselves. And in some regards, what happens there is because there's an experience. This is kind of a form of discrimination or prejudice, because somebody has had these experiences with some or many men, that all men are guilty. And we had one incident where the owner of the school, it wasn't the head of the school, it was the owner, and it was a big kind of thing. I think heading into test or something. He was giving this conversation, and he was talking about situational awareness, right? And he was going on about like, okay, ladies, if you're at the bar, be with a friend, park someplace that's well lit, don't go off with somebody you don't know, reconsider wearing high heels when you have a long way to go, like all this stuff, right? Pretty much common sense stuff, just about, you know, and this one lady came unhinged. She is like, no, you're blaming the victim and all this other stuff. He was shocked. He was shocked at this response. And he said, this is all fine and good. what you're talking about, and you're not wrong. But the reality is this stuff still happens, and it's yeah, it would be a wonderful world if every woman could walk safely through a dark garage by herself in her high heels while she's highly intoxicated and know for sure that she was not going to have somebody assault her while she's in the garage before she manages to get home. I would love that world. I really would. That's the world we should live in. But unfortunately, there are people out there that are looking for their opportunities. And it is hard to think of, because if you don't think that way, what do these guys do? Which is why it's a good idea to take. It's tough, man. It's tough to take these courses that like the police offer about watching for the signs of sexual predators in your train. We had to take that when I was in doing working with kids in the Catholic Church. You have to take these courses that the police officer or a police department teach you about how to identify these guys among your crowd. Because here's another one. They're always like, "Oh, it's another Christian. It's another church guy." No, it has nothing to do with the theology. These guys are going to the easy hunting grounds. They're going where the kids are. They go to places like karate studios and churches and schools and daycares and stuff because that's where the kids are. They don't give a shit about Christ or ideology or whatever. They'll put on whatever mask they need to get access to the kids. And this is what you have to look out for, right? That's the kind of stuff they teach you. And you come, I tell you what, man, you take those courses and you come home and you don't want to talk to anybody. You hate humanity. You know what I mean? But it's important. Defense against the dark arts is what it is, and that's kind of the stuff that we were teaching in karate too, is that, you're not supposed to use this stuff. You're not. In play of some sort, okay, and we had a lot of fun, man. We had so much fun. God, I really hope you never need to use any of this stuff. But if you do, you have these tools in your belt. And while I hope none of my students ever went through any situation where they would feel a need to use those tools, I hope that I was somehow helpful in training them to be able to get out of a situation they otherwise might have not gotten out of or whatever. Um, because while we had a lot of fun, the core message is, the law exists, civilization exists, Hammurabi's code, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land so that the strong do not overpower the weak. Okay? The law of nature, the law of the jungle, the strong overpower the weak. And it is only our intellect and our rules and our general watching out for each other that tries to prevent that from happening, but it doesn't always not happen. And somebody I know works with kids that have had to deal with and live in the aftermath of these awful human beings that have done things to them, and tries to help them and pick them up. And that is all the law can do when someone violates the rules of civilization. The society can help in the aftermath, and they can punish these people if they especially if they're at the top. If they have the political will and wherewithal to engage them and remove them from society so that they aren't harming other people. But it the law doesn't help you. It's the whole adage of, yeah, the walk sign says go, but that car is coming. And it's the same with the girl in the parking lot. If you're on your phone and walking with loud shoes and it's dark and you're laughing with your friend and you're kind of tipsy and stuff, you're a perfect mark for the guy that wants to do that stuff. Not that there's anyone there, but that's what they're looking for. And that's what the head of the school was talking about. And the dialogue kind of in general kind of made it out like, well, all these guys, every man is bad in some way, and they all need to be educated that this is not acceptable behavior. We know. We all know. Even the bad guys know that. They just choose not to not do it. You know what I mean? Um, but anyway, it's just something I'm thinking about, because some of these things that are just basic to me, basic manners, basic humanity, basic respect for another person's autonomy and physical, just their physical space. It's just so natural to me. It's so basic, as it is. I'm not really much of a touchy feely person, especially not in public. I hate the kiss on the cheek that the French do and stuff. I never liked the idea of even touching another man's wife or any of that other stuff. Like hugging in public. Hugs are about as much as I like to do anyway, because I just feel awkward. I don't know why. It's just how I am. But I would never do most of this stuff, and I don't say that like, oh, I'm high and mighty. No, it just it viscerally it can't happen. We'd have, oh my god, my sensei Lori. Okay, Lori was this badger of a woman. She was probably about 10 or 15 years older than me, and she was short, little blonde, stocky thing. And she had trained in kung fu before she came to karate. She was wild, man. She was so skilled. And I'd always be that guy in the class, the big dude, the uke, the punching bag. It's not punching bag, it's trading partner, but punching bag is what it meant. I was on the ground a lot, boy, in the air, all that other stuff. But one time in class, this happened a couple of times, especially that summer. Boy, I was almost done with her, man. She would say things like, "Choke me," which to some people that sounds like all right, no, no, oh no, no, don't, no, and she'd, oh, choke me. Okay, so I'd go and I'd put my hands on her throat, but very loosely, and then she'd slap me in the kidneys. Ah, god, choke me. So one of the things that I would do, particularly when I'm practicing for technique, for effectiveness, is I wouldn't actually start to constrict. I would lock my hands in such a way as if I were choking you, and my fingers are rigid, but I'm not actually squeezing, right? So that's the kind of the default chokehold that I would do for training. Choking is not really a great way to attack somebody anyway, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, you put your hands on her and lock the hands, and she my kidneys. And I could feel these safety valves that I have to flip in my brain to actually make this happen, what she's asking me to do to her. Because she's my elder, she's a woman, she is smaller than me, she's, just basic humanity, all these other things. I'm in front of a crowd of kids that are seeing this, so they might get the wrong lesson, like all that stuff. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in my brain, and it takes me a while to get to a point where, like, okay, here we go. And even then I still have the safety valve that if she in any way communicates distress, I'm letting go. That's just how I am. That's instinct. It's not some sort of moral prerogative. That's what I'm trying to communicate here. And of course, though, god, once that happened and I actually constricted, she'd get this twinkle in her eye, and I knew I was in for it. And there'd be pain in some part of my body that I didn't even know I had, or I'd be looking at the floor from the different angle than it had been just a moment before, or whatever. I'd be standing in a different direction than I was, and suddenly things were happening to me or whatever. Um, and that summer was rough, man, because summer semester is long too. I was assisting in her, or I was training in her class, but I was the senior student, so that made me the punching bag. Um, but that's that's it for me. And I don't know what else to say about that. And I guess my solipsism, my myopia, my belief that my world is the only other one, and all these realities that I try to pry open and imagine doing awful things, is so hard to open and explore that I just kind of assume everyone acts that way too. And it's always such a shock to me when I realize how awful so many people are. And I know intellectually, I know. And again, this is not good versus evil, at least not in my perspective. It's just, are you a basic human and treating others with respect? Or are you not? And who taught you that this was acceptable? How long have you been getting away with this behavior? But anyway, that's kind of what's on my brain today. And that's just kind of a interesting dialogue that we're having because I don't. These are things I don't think about, and it's my own bias and bigotry and all that other stuff, and I continue to learn. Trying to entertain the way other people are experiencing the world, and trying my best to understand their experience, which I can understand their experience when they're decent people easily enough. It's trying to put my feet in the shoes of the offender that I have a hard time doing. Because why would you do that? Why? Why would you not want to be liked by society? Why would you want to be viewed as a rude, belligerent, groping jerk? Why would you even do that? What's going through your mind? They don't like it. You know, you know what I mean? Like, what's the, I guess because you get what you want, I guess, or some satisfaction. You're desirable, maybe. I don't know. I can't process it. I try. I really do. But maybe that's just for the best, you know. But it shuts me off also from some of the true awful realities that are happening around us that I really don't want to think about. I don't really want to process that stuff. Like when I go to the police station to renew those certificates when I have to, the certification for that, because they do. They have to figure out how these guys are operating, and I know people that have been traumatized by their work and having to think how these people think. So anyway, that's it for me today.